Carney's confidence collapses as conservatives deliver harsh blow to his economic reputation. The House of Commons erupted this week with high political drama as newly appointed Prime Minister M5ark Carney faced a relentless barrage from Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. The issue? The Liberal government's refusal to present a spring budget while requesting Parliament's approval for over $500 billion in spending. Carney, who promised fiscal prudence and transparency, offered neither. With Canadians struggling to afford basic necessities and financial confidence faltering, the absence of a clear economic plan is triggering alarm across party lines. Instead of a vision, the Liberals delivered talking points, and instead of numbers, they gave excuses. M5ark Carney's entry into politics was greeted with headlines proclaiming him as the grown-up in the room, a former Bank of Canada and Bank of England governor, the kind of technocrat who could supposedly steady a wobbly economy. But Carney's early performance as Prime Minister is casting serious doubt on that narrative. His background in central banking, while impressive, has so far not translated into political clarity or decisive leadership. His government promised to cap spending growth at 2%, but instead pushed it up by 8%, revealing a growing disconnect between lofty promises and fiscal discipline. For a man who built his reputation managing risk, Carney now appears to be gambling with the country's finances. Frustrated with the lack of transparency, the Conservatives brought forward a motion demanding the immediate release of a federal budget. Their argument is simple: if every family, business, and province is expected to live within its means, why is Ottawa asking for record-breaking spending with zero fiscal roadmap? The Liberals delayed again, citing long-term planning and consultations. Poilievre was blunt. Canadians have waited long enough. They deserve to see where their money is going. Carney's delay only reinforces suspicions that his government is scrambling behind the scenes to patch over widening cracks in its fiscal narrative. As the pressure mounted, Carney's answers became increasingly defensive and condescending. One of his now infamous responses, "Unlike the member opposite, I know the difference between the main estimates and a budget," was repeated twice during question period, likely intended as a clever dismissal. But it backfired. Rather than displaying control or wit, Carney came across as patronizing and out of touch. In the eyes of many MPs, especially those on the opposition benches, it was not the language of leadership but of arrogance, and one that undermines his attempt to brand himself as a collaborative unifier above political bickering. The Carney government's lack of direction isn't confined to fiscal matters. Immigration has quickly become another source of growing concern. With nearly 5 million people currently in Canada expected to have their visas expire by year's end, serious questions are being raised about the capacity of federal systems to manage the sheer volume. And yet, the Liberals have failed to present a credible plan to handle this approaching crisis. Bureaucratic delays and vague commitments are leaving hundreds of thousands in legal limbo, while municipal governments warn that housing, healthcare, and public transit are already stretched beyond their limits. In response, the new Minister of Immigration promised to strengthen the system and ensure Canada remains a leader in humanitarian response. However, critics argue that maintaining high immigration targets without scaling up infrastructure is unsustainable. Further inflaming the issue was the recent revelation that the government issued over 177,000 new temporary foreign worker permits in just the first few months of 2025, a 10% spike from the same period last year. This rapid influx is the equivalent of adding an entire city like Regina in a single quarter. While labor shortages exist, the scale and pace of foreign worker arrivals has raised concerns about wage suppression and job competition for Canadian youth. Meanwhile, the cost of living crisis continues to cast a long shadow over Carney's early tenure. Groceries, fuel, rent, and utilities are consuming more and more of household budgets. A bag of frozen peas, once $1, now costs over $3.50. Livestock and pet bedding, like pine pellets, used to be $9 a bag, but now retail for $22. These aren't luxury goods. They're basics, and their rising prices are a gut punch to lower-income Canadians, fixed-income seniors, and young families. In cities like Abbotsford and Windsor, local shelters report a rise in families sleeping in cars, even as the federal government insists the economy is strong and growing. This disconnect has not gone unnoticed. Carney speaks of macroeconomic indicators, GDP projections, and net fiscal positions, but Canadians care about whether they can buy groceries without maxing out their credit cards. Poilievre has capitalized on this gap, repeatedly hammering home that everyday people are paying for elite mismanagement. The Prime Minister's insistence that everything is under control only reinforces perceptions that his government is insulated from reality. The Liberals claim the economy is improving, but for many voters, that narrative doesn't match the soaring prices on store shelves or the struggle to find affordable housing. Housing, in fact, remains a political time bomb. In a striking moment during question period, Vancouver East MP Jenny Kwan, no ally of the Conservatives, challenged Carney directly. She denounced his government's continued reliance on private developers to solve a national housing crisis, calling their approach deeply disconnected from lived realities. As a former executive with Brookfield, one of the world's largest real estate asset managers, Carney is seen by critics as too close to the very financial structures driving up housing costs. Despite billions in federal programs, ground-level impact has been minimal. Affordable housing units remain rare, construction is sluggish, and many municipalities say federal plans lack urgency and coordination. Carney's vision of a single Canadian economy, which he described as a cohesive national growth strategy supported by all provinces, is already showing cracks. Premier François Legault has expressed frustration with Ottawa's approach to immigration. Meanwhile, BC Premier David Eby skipped an important federal-provincial meeting entirely, choosing instead to travel to Japan. That absence spoke volumes. Several premiers have voiced concerns about being asked to shoulder the burden of federal decisions on immigration and housing without sufficient funding or collaboration. If Carney hoped to reset federal-provincial relations, the early signs are far from promising. At the heart of the Conservative attack is a broader critique of government accountability, or lack thereof. During COVID-19, the Liberals approved $73 billion in emergency spending while Parliament was suspended. Today, under Carney, they are seeking an additional $26 billion for outside consultants, including controversial firms like McKinsey and Company. Critics argue this further erodes public trust and replaces democratic oversight with corporate influence. The message from opposition benches is clear. Carney has also leaned heavily into environmental policy, defending the carbon tax as essential to long-term sustainability. But internal estimates show the tax only reduces emissions by 6 to 9%. When adjusted for Canada's tiny global emissions share, that translates to an impact of less than 0.1% globally, all while hammering small businesses and rural Canadians with higher energy costs. Carney insists the policy is part of a broader shift to a green economy, but critics say the price is too steep for too little benefit, especially when economic growth remains tepid. As Parliament heads into the summer break, Carney faces an increasingly skeptical electorate. The promise of evidence-based leadership is giving way to frustration over delays, bureaucratic jargon, and a lack of concrete results. Pierre Poilievre continues to seize the narrative, positioning himself as the voice of working-class Canadians and the only alternative to what he calls a government of consultants and gatekeepers. Unless Carney can quickly deliver on the basic expectations of budgetary accountability, housing affordability, and economic clarity, his honeymoon period may be over before it ever began. For now, the pressure is squarely on Carney. The aura of calm expertise is wearing thin. The public wants leadership, not lectures, results, not rhetoric. If this was supposed to be the launch of a new Liberal era under M5ark Carney, it has instead opened with confusion, contradiction, and confrontation. The stage has been set, and Canadians are watching closely to see whether Carney can restore control or whether his confidence continues to collapse under the weight of unmet expectations.